The film is set during the summer of 1990 in Southern California and opens with a grainy VHS recording. The footage follows an unseen scientist named Naren Warren wandering through a mysterious location known as the Backrooms. The endless maze is made up of mono-yellow wallpaper, damp carpet, flickering fluorescent lights, and abandoned rooms that seem to stretch forever. Scattered furniture and random household objects sit throughout the empty halls, as if reality itself has been stitched together incorrectly. Naren records everything on his camera while nervously trying to radio for help. He eventually discovers a strange room filled with old video equipment and cameras, almost like somebody had been studying the place long before him. Suddenly, a seagull flies through the hallway from nowhere, despite there being no visible exit or sky anywhere in the maze. The deeper Naren travels, the more unstable the environment becomes. Eventually he hears heavy footsteps and a low growling sound echoing through the halls. A massive creature slowly emerges from the darkness and begins stomping toward him. Naren panics and desperately searches for somewhere to hide, but the entity catches him. The footage violently cuts out during the attack. The tape is later revealed to be viewed by a group of scientists working for Async Research Institute. The story then shifts to Clark, a failed architect turned struggling furniture store owner. Clark owns a cheap business called Captain Clark's Ottoman Empire, where he films embarrassing pirate-themed television commercials in an attempt to attract customers. His store is losing money rapidly due to competition, debt, and declining sales. Clark is also battling severe alcoholism while going through a painful divorce. Beneath his loud and goofy public image, he is deeply bitter and emotionally unstable. Clark regularly visits his therapist, Dr. Mary Kline. Although Mary spends her days helping patients process trauma, she is quietly haunted by her own past. Her childhood home is currently being demolished, forcing painful memories back to the surface. Mary's mother, Nora Kline, suffered from severe schizophrenia and kept Mary isolated inside a dark apartment with newspaper-covered windows during her childhood. Mary constantly carries around a broken chunk of concrete containing the imprint of her childhood handprint, using it as an emotional anchor connected to the only place she ever considered home. During one therapy session, Mary asks Clark to role-play conversations involving his failed marriage and alcoholism. The exercise quickly spirals into genuine anger as Clark lashes out emotionally, venting years of resentment and frustration. His inability to accept responsibility becomes painfully obvious. Meanwhile, Clark's store begins suffering from strange electrical problems. The power repeatedly cuts out, and the electricity bill suddenly becomes astronomically high. Clark hires an electrician to inspect the basement. While checking the breaker panels, they discover 3 unusual switches positioned diagonally on a hidden section of the wall. The switches appear completely disconnected from the rest of the building's electrical system. Later that night, Clark remains alone in the store watching television, when the broadcast is interrupted by distorted footage from the Backrooms. Moments later, the television shuts off entirely. Curious and unsettled, Clark returns to the basement where he notices light leaking through a crack hidden behind one of the walls. As he touches the surface, his hand suddenly phases through it. Clark accidentally no-clips through reality itself and falls directly into the Backrooms. Inside the maze, Clark wanders through endless yellow corridors in complete disbelief. The environment feels empty yet somehow alive. He discovers rooms filled with random furniture, strange voices speaking in different languages, and objects partially fused into the floors and walls as if reality is decaying. Clark even finds Naren Warren's employee badge, though there is no sign of his body. At one point, Clark encounters the same monstrous entity from the VHS tape and barely manages to escape back into the store's basement. However, instead of staying away, Clark becomes completely obsessed with the Backrooms. Elsewhere, Async Research Institute scientists observe footage of Clark entering the dimension. A lead researcher named Phil watches carefully, immediately recognizing that another civilian has discovered the phenomenon. Clark returns to Mary and attempts to explain what he saw, but she assumes his bizarre descriptions are simply symptoms of alcohol withdrawal and deteriorating mental health. Desperate to prove himself, Clark recruits his assistant manager Kat Taylor and her boyfriend Bobby Roberts to help him document the strange space. Clark marks the hidden entrance using blue tape and leads Kat and Bobby into the Backrooms. All 3 are stunned by the impossible environment. The deeper they travel, the more disturbing the maze becomes. The Backrooms begins generating spaces based on human memory, but the recreations are always slightly incorrect, almost like a malfunctioning biological machine trying to imitate reality. In one horrifying sequence, the floor of a normal-looking living room collapses downward into infinite copies of the same room, each version becoming more decayed and corrupted than the last. The Backrooms appears to absorb human thoughts and trauma, using them to construct endless distorted environments. While exploring deeper sections of the backrooms, Clark, Kat, and Bobby come across a massive opening in the floor that descends into darkness. The pit is filled with piles of discarded clothing stretching far below them. Wanting to investigate, they tie a rope around Bobby while he keeps recording everything with the camera. As Bobby descends deeper into the pit, he notices that the clothing scattered across the floor looks disturbingly recent. Some outfits appear decades old, while others look completely modern. Among the pile, Bobby suddenly spots a t-shirt identical to the one he had been wearing earlier that same day, implying that the Backrooms is somehow copying objects and people in real time. Several pieces of clothing are stained with blood, making the entire space feel even more disturbing. While searching through the pile, Bobby suddenly hears a low growling sound echoing from somewhere in the darkness. He freezes in fear as the sound grows louder. Panicking, Bobby screams for help and desperately grabs onto the rope, yelling for Clark and Kat to pull him back up immediately. Clark and Kat quickly begin pulling Bobby upward. When Bobby reaches the top, he looks completely terrified and struggles to explain what he saw below. Before he can say anything else, a monstrous force suddenly grabs him from beneath the darkness. The rope violently tightens as Bobby is yanked downward with incredible force. Kat and Clark desperately try to hold onto him, struggling to keep him from being dragged away. The sudden force pulls both of them forward, causing them to fall onto the floor while Bobby continues screaming. The footage shakily captures him being dragged violently across the ground toward a sealed opening in the wall. The entity pulls Bobby's bloody body into the dark space before the wall suddenly closes behind him. Bobby disappears completely. Clark quickly grabs Bobby's dropped camera and continues recording, while Kat runs after Bobby into the maze. In the chaos, Kat becomes separated from Clark somewhere within the endless hallways. Still recording, Clark wanders through increasingly strange rooms while calling out for Kat and Bobby. He eventually enters a bizarre room, illuminated only by a glowing Christmas tree, standing alone in the middle of the darkness. Nearby, he notices two distorted humanoid figures standing completely still. Their bodies resemble poorly recreated humans, frozen between movement and decay like unfinished copies of real people. One of the figures, a warped female humanoid, slowly begins turning toward Clark before silently walking in his direction. Terrified, Clark immediately runs away deeper into the maze. Clark eventually stumbles into another room, partially flooded with shallow water. As he nervously moves through the space, he suddenly hears Kat's voice calling out nearby. Believing she is behind one of the walls, Clark places the camera down on a nearby table and rushes toward the sound. Kat can see Clark from the opposite side of the wall, but he cannot see or hear her properly through the distorted structure. While Clark desperately searches for her, an unseen figure slowly reaches into frame from behind and grabs the camera off the table. The footage shakily turns toward Clark as the entity slowly advances toward him from the darkness. At the same time, Mary grows increasingly concerned after Clark leaves a disturbing voicemail claiming he is never coming back. Clark also suddenly stops attending his therapy sessions entirely. Meanwhile, at his home, Async researcher Phil is casually watching television with his family when a cheap pirate-themed furniture commercial suddenly appears on screen. Phil immediately recognizes Clark from the footage recorded inside the Backrooms and realizes the civilian they observed earlier is now connected to the growing anomaly. Concerned for Clark's safety, Mary decides to visit his furniture showroom herself. The building appears strangely abandoned and partially dark due to the ongoing electrical failures. As she searches through the store calling Clark's name, she notices signs that somebody has been obsessively investigating something in the basement. Mary eventually heads downstairs and discovers pieces of blue tape placed around a hidden section of the wall. Nearby, she notices maps and strange notes scattered across tables on the floor. She immediately recognizes one of the maps as the same rough layout Clark showed her during one of their last therapy sessions while trying to explain the impossible maze he had discovered. As Mary studies the wall more closely, she notices a faint light leaking through the surface itself. Nervously reaching forward, her hand passes directly through the wall. Shocked but determined to find Clark, Mary slowly steps through the opening and enters the Backrooms alone. Inside, Mary finds herself trapped inside endless yellow hallways covered in stained wallpaper beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. The deeper she travels, the stranger the environment becomes. Some rooms appear abandoned while others look partially constructed, as though reality itself is unfinished. Mary desperately searches for Clark while calling out his name through the maze. As she wanders deeper into the Backrooms, Mary begins discovering environments seemingly generated from fragmented human memory. She enters rooms filled with distorted furniture, endless hallways repeating themselves, and spaces that physically should not exist. Eventually, she comes across a strange wall covered in disturbing paintings and childlike drawings. While examining the wall, Clark suddenly appears behind her. At first he speaks calmly, almost relieved to see her, but his behavior quickly becomes unstable. Before Mary can react, Clark suddenly grabs her by the throat and places her in a chokehold until she loses consciousness. When Mary wakes up, she finds herself tied to a chair inside a grotesque imitation of a dining room. The room resembles a normal household setting, but everything looks slightly wrong. Like an imperfect memory reconstructed by something non-human, sitting around the table are 3 distorted humanoid replicas with melted faces and unnatural body proportions. Their movements are stiff and delayed, almost mannequin-like. Clark sits calmly beside them as if this horrifying environment is completely normal. He explains to Mary that the Backrooms recreates people and objects from memory, but imperfectly. According to him, these replica bodies are better than real people because they do not feel pain. To prove his point, Clark suddenly slices open the stomach of one of the humanoid replicas with a knife. Instead of blood or organs, sponge-like material spills out from inside its body. Clark casually cuts pieces from the creature and places them onto dishes at the dining table, as if preparing dinner. The entire scene grows increasingly disturbing as Clark continues rambling about how peaceful life inside the Backrooms can be. At one point, Clark cuts hair from one of the female replicas, like removing a wig, before awkwardly placing it onto Mary's head, trying to force her into reenacting his failed marriage therapy roleplay. Clark desperately tries to recreate moments from his past while pretending Mary is his ex-wife. Mary finally stops playing along and bluntly tells Clark the truth. She explains that his wife did not leave because of bad luck or unfair circumstances, but because Clark constantly blamed everyone else for his own misery and refused to take responsibility for his actions. Mary then carefully changes her tone and tries to calm him down. She tells Clark that if he truly wants to remain inside the Backrooms, that is his choice, but he should let her leave peacefully. Clark silently approaches Mary while holding the knife. Slowly, he unties one of her hands. Suddenly, heavy footsteps begin echoing from somewhere outside the room. The entire atmosphere instantly changes. The distorted female replica suddenly panics and runs away in terror. The room falls completely silent as something massive approaches from the darkness beyond the hallway. Moments later, a gigantic humanoid creature enters the room. The monster resembles a horrifying twisted version of Clark's pirate mascot persona. Its massive skeletal body is warped and deformed, with stretched facial features resembling Clark himself dressed as Captain Clark. Its limbs appear partially wooden and unnaturally long, while its face constantly shifts between human and monstrous. Clark surprisingly does not panic. Instead, he calmly steps toward the creature and attempts to speak with it like an old friend, reassuring it that everything is fine and that Mary is not a threat. While Clark is distracted, Mary fully unties herself from the chair. Without warning, the giant creature suddenly grabs Clark, lifts him into the air, and violently bites into his neck. Clark dies almost instantly as blood pours across the floor. Mary immediately runs from the room while the monstrous pirate creature chases after her through the maze. As she flees deeper into the Backrooms, the environment begins collapsing and shifting around her. Mary crawls through a tight opening between walls and suddenly discovers an enormous distorted structure stretching endlessly downward beneath her. The architecture resembles an impossible decaying building, folded into itself infinitely. Desperately searching for an escape route, Mary finds a narrow staircase leading upward through the collapsing structure. Eventually, she reaches what appears to be an exact replica of Clark's furniture showroom lobby. However, many of the doors open directly into solid walls or endless darkness, making the environment feel incomplete and broken. The pirate creature continues pursuing her through the maze. Exhausted and cornered, Mary finally stops running and grabs a wooden object to defend herself. When the creature attacks, Mary manages to smash one of its wooden legs, partially crippling it. As she continues escaping, Mary accidentally triggers an emergency gas system somewhere inside the structure. Alarms immediately begin blaring throughout the Backrooms, while gas floods sections of the environment. Both Mary and the wounded creature collapse during the struggle. The monster crawls toward her using Clark's distorted face while attempting to bite her again. In desperation, Mary grabs the broken concrete piece from her childhood driveway and repeatedly smashes the creature across the face. She then escapes through a narrow opening in the wall, too small for the massive creature to follow. On the other side, hazmat-suited personnel are already waiting for her. Before Mary can react, the agents release gas directly into her face and knock her unconscious. Mary later wakes up inside Async Research Institute, surrounded by medical equipment. Scientists perform X-rays and scanning tests on her body before eventually bringing her into a sterile interrogation room. There, she finally meets Phil, one of Async's lead researchers. Phil calmly questions Mary about everything she witnessed inside the backrooms, while attempting to gather more information about the growing anomaly. He explains that Async originally manufactured MRI machines before accidentally discovering the extra-dimensional space years earlier. Since then, the company has secretly attempted to map and contain the backrooms while hiding its existence from the public. Phil also reveals that unstable null zones are beginning to appear across Southern California, suggesting reality itself is becoming weaker. As the conversation ends, Mary quietly asks Phil, "What's going to happen to me?" Phil pauses before coldly replying, "That decision is not up to me." At that moment, Mary realizes Async has no intention of letting her return to her normal life. In the film's final post-credit scene, the camera slowly moves through the deepest levels of the backrooms. Hidden within the endless yellow maze is a nearly perfect recreation of Async's interrogation room. Sitting motionless inside the room is a faceless, still-life replica of Mary, frozen in the same chair where she was questioned earlier. The fluorescent lights continue endlessly humming as the screen cuts to black.